Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Morgan Hafner with Becker's Hospital Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. In about a week following the webinar, we will be sending all registrants a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. Please be patient as the post-webinar preparation of materials can take some time. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Our first presenter, David Steenerson, is Vice President of Finance Central Region for OSF Healthcare System in Peoria, Illinois. In addition to his financial responsibilities to improve business performance, David oversees forecasting, budgeting, strategic planning, and benchmarking activities for OSF Central Region. David previously served in senior financial leadership roles in both not-for-profit and for-profit environments, and within integrated delivery systems and standalone facilities. Linda Albury is Senior Vice President with I Vantage. Linda has 25 years of broad and diverse experience in healthcare leadership and currently serves as the Senior Vice President of Business Development and Strategy for I Vantage Health Analytics. Previous positions include Chief Operating Officer for a large tertiary hospital in the Midwest and Senior Vice President of Operations with a major revenue cycle provider and clinical and quality consulting firm. At this time, I am pleased to turn the floor over to Linda to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Morgan, and good afternoon, everyone. Today, we are going to really talk about the essential need for performance improvement in today's environment. We're going to talk about a case for benchmarking, and we are going to hear the story of OSF and their journey to performance excellence. Our learning objectives are listed on the slide. We're going to talk about how to use benchmarking and how that use can create leadership focus and drive employee engagement around performance improvement. You'll have a chance to learn how OSF created a data-driven performance improvement-minded culture across all of their departments, including clinical, support, and operational. And you'll learn how to help your organization identify the proper approach and necessary infrastructure components associated with sustainable success. Next slide. Thank you. A little bit about OSF. I'm going to really let Dave dive into this a little more, but if you are not aware of OSF, it is a 13-hospital system serving Illinois and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It is a faith-based system that includes not only hospitals, but a vast array of physicians as well. Next slide. And I'm from I Vantage Health Analytics, as Morgan already mentioned. I Vantage is a provider of healthcare analytics for hospitals and health systems. We help hospitals and health systems identify and understand and prioritize their opportunities for improvement in the areas of market growth, operations, clinical, quality, and cost. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the next generation of benchmarking as the beginning of a sustainable cost improvement pathway. So first I'd like to start with just speaking about the environment today. And I'll let you read this slide, but by all accounts, there's an emerging burning platform to support cost management in healthcare today. So this information on the slide was reported back in January. Cost reduction tops the list of CFO priorities. And although this isn't new or a unique perspective, what is different now is that there is limited confidence in a CFO's ability to trust data and to use that data to reduce costs and make those reductions sticky. Next slide. So today we're going to talk about OSF and how they use the I Vantage benchmarking platform to get the right data to identify, size, and prioritize their cost improvement agenda. For those of you participating today who have limited familiarity with benchmarking, at its core, benchmarking compares your performance to a relevant peer group to identify the variance between where you are and where you could be. And that delta is your opportunity for improvement and is used to set targets, identify strategic imperatives, and even celebrate success. Today, in order to support the complex and sophisticated healthcare systems in the country, benchmarking must go far beyond this basic description. Next slide. So I'd like you to look at this slide and read some of these comments. If you have used older benchmarking systems, I can guarantee that you've probably heard these reactions from your team. Things like, I don't believe the data, my department is different, I can't understand the math, you just want me to cut staff. These responses are real and likely feed into the CFO's concern about trusting data. Benchmarking today must overcome these perspectives in order to be an integral component of your performance management platform. It is virtually impossible to move forward when your team doesn't trust or believe the data. Next slide. So at I Vantage, we believe that sophisticated health systems require cutting-edge tools to help them manage effectively in this ever-increasing complex industry. So before you embark on this cost reduction journey, be sure you have the tools needed for success. So whether you have a benchmarking tool today or you're seeking one for tomorrow, it must give you accurate data. You should expect your benchmarking partner to provide full transparency into their normalization methodologies and your selected peer group. Your provider should own this process to assure accuracy and to wipe out the variability that exists when hospitals try to map or normalize their own data. Also, be sure your data is integrated. Looking at productivity and supplies is a little old school, and that's not to say that you ignore these areas, but today leaders need a lens into clinical performance, quality performance, operations, all of these areas at the same time to understand and identify the true drivers of cost. You need precision in your approach, so your efforts are focused and targeted to where real opportunity for improvement exists so that you can get the best ROI on your efforts. And your benchmarking platform must be designed so that you engage numerous levels of management within your organization. Only through creating engagement around the data and providing support to your managers and directors will you begin to develop a culture that is data-driven and performance improvement minded. Next slide. And finally, your benchmarking platform should help you answer 4 key questions. First is, how am I performing? This is basic benchmarking. How do you compare to a relevant peer group? Next is, where are my opportunities? This is where you should peel back the layers of performance and the layers of data to identify, size, and prioritize where you focus for the most favorable ROI on your efforts. Third is, how do I improve? What are examples of strong and leading practices? What are some good ideas that will help your frontline directors craft plans to achieve improvement? As leaders, you are compelled to support the people you lean on to drive the actual change, giving them tools not previously available with legacy benchmarking platforms. And then finally, am I making progress? Your platform should provide options to track and manage initiatives and measure your results. This is where you create clear goals, establish accountability, and begin to weave performance management into the rhythm of your operations for sustained improvement. So I ask that you keep these 4 questions in mind when you hear the story of OSF, and you will see how they continually ask and answer these questions to drive their efforts and to create a culture around challenging the status quo and driving their results. And they've done this through broad engagement across their organization. So now I'm going to move to Dave, and he's going to tell you the story of OSF.
Yes, thank you, Linda. I'm glad everyone had a chance to join us today. Just a quick further introduction about OSF Healthcare. As was earlier introduced, we're about $2.8 billion in net patient service revenue, 13 hospitals, and more than 150 physician sites. We are a very much of an integrated delivery system at this point, but we haven't always been that way. And right now today, we have a mix of critical access hospitals, general community hospitals, and also a tertiary quaternary center. And we're serve both rural and small urban communities in Illinois and up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My goal today is to really walk you through how we did that, and hopefully you'll pick up a few tidbits so that you can apply those to your organization. So hopefully your time will be well spent today. Give a little background about OSF itself. In about 2012, we hit a bit of a crossroads in our history. We had a long history of profitability, growth. We had a real strong establishment of commitment to performance improvement. We had fully deployed our Epic electronic medical record across our entire system. And we were beginning to take on risk contracting, such as the Accountable Care Organization with Pioneer ACO with Medicare. At the same time, we were experiencing significant changes in our payer mix, case mix, and ultimately we were seeing a pretty severe reduction in our margin. In fact, we actually had an operationally unprofitable year, which was very, very uncharacteristic for us. At the same time, we were more of refer to it as a confederacy of different markets. We had a lot of local autonomy, although we did have some standardized policies and procedures and functions and whatnot, but we were very much a locally led organization. Each of our markets was locally led. We also had a recent change in our chief executive officer, and he really implored upon us that we needed to take a new direction. We needed to build a cost management competency. Historically, we had been able to grow our revenue to solve any of our financial shortcomings, but he drove us and led us in a way to really improve our cost consciousness to be able to make that happen. The pathway that we chose to do that is to utilize benchmarking, and I'll go into some of the specifics about how we did this in just the next few slides. But we leveraged benchmarking. We involved the entire organization to be able to drive meaningful and sustainable cost savings across the organization. But we also realized we needed to do this in a way that did not sacrifice clinical quality. In fact, our goal was to improve clinical quality and improve our employee engagement and improve our patients' experience. By going through this over the last several years, today we are very much more of a operationally driven company that's not just a confederacy of local markets, but rather we have much more standardization. We've centralized some functions, and we've improved and built our cultural transition to be able to move to data-driven and making change based on data and performance improvement. So let's go on to the next slide, and I'll show you some specifics. We had used benchmarking for many, many, many years, and we kind of dabbled in how we apply that to our performance improvement process. Quite frankly, we needed the energy and the emphasis and encouragement to really drive into and use the benchmarking information to drive our focus of our change. And quite frankly, there's nothing like a burning platform of negative margins to really inspire that change. The analysis in the benchmarking showed lots of different areas of opportunities from staffing and skill mix to really looking at individual departments and understanding where those areas could develop our first areas of focus and attention. Next slide, please. Because we were a conglomeration of local markets, we felt like the most effective way to begin to implement quick change and quicker change was to start at the local level and really implore the individual leadership teams to be able to brainstorm ideas, and really take advantage of the data to focus our attention. Each of the organizations established a several cross-functional collaborative teams. And when we say cross-functional, that includes clinical folks, not just nurses and technicians, but also the physicians, support staff, leadership, as well as always supporting each of these teams with strong financial analytical support to make sure that we were understanding the data and then applying it and quantifying particular opportunities as they brought themselves forth. We felt like the key to our success was by having the cross-functional teams, we were really able to attain buy-in and get quality decisions and outline our objectives in a way that was balanced, and it was really not just a axe-cutting sort of exercise. But we couldn't do it just locally, so we beefed up our system-wide support by having an overall steering team, and basically their role was to assure results and assure that the activities were focusing on the important objectives. We established a project management office, and they met to assure that all of the particular teams were staying on task and meeting their deadlines, and that they all reported upon their milestones. We also felt it was important to have a communication strategy. We really needed to increase the transparency and inform all of our mission partners, not just leadership, but everybody, in order to make sure that they understood what was happening, what was the broader context about what was happening, and why we were doing that. And that transparency really helped improve the engagement of our employee and our overall workforce. And finally, we felt the need, and do this to this day, a strong performance tracking mindset. We established an online tool that is shared across all of our organizations, and there was an expectation that as each of these teams deployed and implemented a particular tactic or objective, that they would track those results, they would list them on this tracking tool so that all the other organizations could also look at that and understand what those ideas might be as a way to share our ideas across the different organizations. And finally, one of the things that we did from a system-wide perspective is we aligned our incentives. We have a team award concept for all of our mission partners, non-management and also management, of course, too. But included in that, one of the objectives of all that was to institute an incentive that included a cost reduction goal. So everybody was kind of aligned, was thoroughly aligned in how we move forward and made the emphasis to make this happen. Next slide, please. We did call it a program. I hesitate to call it that because it was really a cultural shift in how we did this. We called it ACT, and the ACT was an acronym for the Accelerated Clinical and Cost Transformation. And it was really about action in trying to make things happen. And to that end, initially, while there was a strong emphasis to build this competency and skill set within our organization, we did use a consultant to help get us going in our three largest markets. And so while that did help us achieve the acceleration component of our objective, the overall goal was really to build our internal independence and competency so that we didn't need a consultant every time we needed to achieve a financial improvement objective. But it was really about jumpstarting and getting us that initial push to get the infrastructure built and to get underway. Quite frankly, it was quite cheap in the whole scheme of things, especially with the results that we were able to achieve. At all three of those facilities, then we delved into a structured brainstorming process, which literally developed thousands of ideas, which were developed out of the benchmarks to look at all those opportunities and getting the right people at the table to be able to brainstorm and set up all those types of activities. Then we went into a risk rating evaluation perspective process where each of the brainstormed ideas, we calculated a rough financial estimate, which was usually based on the benchmarking information that we had. Then we also looked at other factors such as the ease and speed of implementation, and we did have a bias in our scoring tool, a bias towards to acting and action and getting things quickly achievable. And finally, we measured our objectives and our ideas based on its adherence to mission. We are a faith-based organization that is heavily mission-oriented, and we really evaluated a particular opportunity to make sure that it fit within what our sisters are guiding us to do. Ultimately, those were triaged and prioritized, and senior leadership ultimately approved which tactics and objectives to go after. Senior leadership took the view and used their perspective to make sure that we were having a good balance of quality initiatives, improving the patient experience, again, adhering to the mission, and working on assisting with any cultural acceptance and assistance with engaging our physicians and ultimately our staff. Some ideas that had large financial returns were actually not done because of the injury proneness that it would be to our mission. There were plenty of other financial opportunities to go after first. We certainly didn't want to sacrifice mission as one of those first things to do. Again, we did build a structure that devoted on accountability for all of those implementation teams, for all those objectives towards action. And there were two general broad categories of areas in which we looked at. There were individual departments. And if we had an individual department, in this case, I've used the neonatal intensive care, but it might be lab, it might be housekeeping. There are actions that any department can make pretty much within themselves to be able to achieve an improvement in their benchmark performance. Additionally, there are some organizational-wide actions that can be done. I use supply chain as an example, but in our case, we had information systems that were deployed across the entire organization. So those areas, while they are a department, they're a department that serves all 13 of our hospitals and all of our physician offices. So they were implored to go forward and make their changes to be able to help and benefit everybody within the organization because of their broad reach. Finally, and another key point of all this, and I will emphasize this a couple of times, is to track progress of our teams. We used a green, red, and yellow light scenario. If things were red, we needed to understand why, because many times there are barriers. It's not that the team wasn't doing good work, they just hit a roadblock and needed some senior leadership to be able to push them through that. And then, of course, most of ours were green, which is good. And yellow, most of the time when we gave it a yellow, it was more that the objective was still good, but we were just struggling to get it done as quickly as what we had wanted to do. And finally, we had a huge amount of diligence in reporting and validating the results of all these activities. We wanted to make sure that we could measure the progress that was in fact being made. Next slide, please. And to that end, these are four big, broad categories that we measured our objectives. Supplies and productivity were certainly large areas, and benchmarking was critical in us being able to assess all of that. And as we look towards gaining our efficiencies in those particular areas, my editorial comment is that there's always going to be opportunities in supplies based on product changes and everything that's out there. The benchmarking really helps us keep up the energy as the benchmarks are improving their supply costs, so should we. And there's so many changes in vendors and in products and in the commodities of all that. It's really a challenge for the supply chain to keep up with all of that and be able to deliver the cost saving results. Productivity, that gets a little harder to do sometimes because as we eliminated some of the low-hanging fruit in gaining our efficiencies, which, by the way, we did almost exclusively by attrition. We did not have any layoffs of any magnitude. We didn't have to do any of the Ward Act reporting. We did have some targeted trimming here and there, but quite frankly, the vast majority of what we did was through attrition and being able to get through that diligence. Attrition can sometimes slow down our efforts, but we felt with the level of turnover that we are and the size of our organization, we were making quick enough progress in productivity improvement without injuring the employee experience. And the sisters feel very, very strongly about taking good care of our employees. So that was a really important competency for us to achieve. And finally, something we call clinical efficiency. And that's basically looking at all of our DRGs, service lines, and understanding how are we delivering that care, and is it the most efficient manner, and are we matching up with how the use of various resources, and how does that work into the benchmarking tool? And the tool does really help with all of that. This really are kind of the objectives and the percentages that applied in the first 4 years of our activity. The smaller orange bucket on there called Other is essentially what we've characterized as functional transformation. And that's where we started to move from local management of many functions and moving those across the entire ministry. And as we moved certain things to ministry-wide deliverables, for example, we moved finance, accounts payable and payroll. We moved legal. All of that was done at each local level, and now it's broadly based across the ministry. And as we move those into functional transformation, what we learned is that essentially the first year or two of any functionally transformed department is that they need to stabilize themselves and get used to working across the entire ministry. After about a year or so, depending on how successful they are in their deployment, they really start to focus on improving organization-wide performance to be able to achieve the benefits from a cost perspective, but also from a deliverable perspective. So that's really worked well for us. As we get into years 5 and 6, the functional transformation orange bucket there is getting larger as we move through the process. Next slide, please. Over 4 years, during the first 4 years, we achieved what we refer to as annualized cost savings of about $160 million. That actually continues to grow as we go forward. That's $160 million is about 7% of our overall cost structure. So this is a material change in our financial performance and the culture to be able to achieve it. This particular slide depicts kind of, I'll call it the low-hanging fruit slide. Year one, 42% of that $160 million of permanent cost savings, annualized reduction in our costs was achieved in that first year, and that's really the low-hanging fruit. As we go forward, years 2, 3, and 4, we see a reduction in that, but we're still achieving results that are sticking, that are staying within staying out. The costs are staying out of the organization. Basically, we added a level of rigor to our reporting. For example, if we did a change, maybe a department dropped by X number of FTEs in year 1, but in year 3, they had to bring a couple of those FTEs back. We removed the cost savings of the difference of those added back FTEs so that we're really only looking at those savings that have permanently stuck and stayed with the organization. And we've only done that on an annualized basis. So we didn't save $40 million a year. We are saving today $160 million out of our cost structure from where we were in 2012. And certainly not all of that drops to the bottom line because there are things that happen that cause our expenses to increase. For example, we still give raises to our employees every year. And but what it's done is it's freed up our cash flow from an expenditure standpoint to be able to deploy to things that are more strategic or more higher priority within the organization. So this initiative has really helped us free up ongoing cost structure to be able to deploy to more important things to serve our communities. Next slide, please. Some brief examples as to how we've achieved some of these. Almost always these were related to benchmarks. But for example, in dietary services, we took a look at all of the floor stock on each of the nursing units. We looked at some things as simple as, do we provide meetings or food at the various meetings for all of our managers or board members and those kinds of things. So we got very, very granular in how we deployed some of this, especially early on, some of which was to send a message that this was important and that we were only making savings in those things that don't matter to the patient. Managing floor stock, we looked at that heavily, but we found that there was quite a bit of wastage going on, and we could still have floor stock, but and still have a good patient experience. Nursing costs, we looked heavily at the use of agency. We looked heavily at our staffing grids to make sure that the staffing was matching up with our patient care volumes and their needs. Laundry and linen. One example that we've recently done in that area is that unless there is a necessary need for a bed change, linen change, or the patient requests it, we don't change the linens except every third day. And of course, we change them upon discharge and everything else. But it's a way to save not only staff time, but also linen and washing time, and really working on some of those without, again, disrupting the patient experience. We've looked at skill mix, and that came into place in the respiratory therapy and in rehab services. We really looked at what are the best level and license type. Does a licensed person need to be doing all of the work, or are there things that we can bring in lesser skilled folks or lesser licensed folks to be able to work through that? Next slide, please. We also really focused on quality, and the benchmarking that we use compares cost and quality. And this is just a quick illustration of what's happened. The box there is one of our facilities, and it moved from you can see how directionally it moved up and to the left. And that means they lowered they improved their cost efficiency, but at the same time, they improved their quality. And this was a great illustrator of what we were really attempting to achieve in both cost and quality to be able to get the necessary results. Let's take a few minutes and dive into a couple of specific examples that we have. So next slide, please. One area that we looked at specifically relates to labor productivity and how we really looked at patient types and matching it up with our RNs specifically in this case. But I'll back up for a second. First of all, house-wide, the first bullet point on here is that we established an FDE committee to not only review new positions, but also review replacement positions. And each request comes in with heavily supported data compared to benchmark, and really the drive is to improve the data and the rigor around all FDE and staffing replacements. In addition to that, specifically, we looked at our neonatal intensive care unit. At the point that we embarked on this, we only had one level of neonatal intensive care, and it was the highest, most critical level for that service. And the alternative essentially was then a lower newborn nursery. And the staffing ratio for the NICU was 1 to 2 patients for every RN. We looked at we involved the clinical folks, the physicians, the nurse caregivers, and reviewed the literature and really focused on doing this in a best practice way, and decided and ultimately implemented an intermediate neonatal level of care. And the staffing ratio for those babies is about 3 to 4 patients per nurse. So as you can see, when we take our intensive care unit and split it into 2 categories, still maintaining 1 to 2 patients per nurse in the intensive care, but we expanded the population that the nurses can handle in the intermediate care because of their less acuity. We're able to make a substantial savings in our labor costs and still maintaining the high quality of care. And we do show up well in other benchmarks outside of I Vantage too in our clinical quality. The next example is supply costs. And as I mentioned earlier, this is an area that, next slide please, that tends to keep on giving as things change and we really adapt and adopt new products and new providers of those products. This was an aggressive area for our focus. And at the same time that we had started in this endeavor, we changed group purchasing organizations. So there was a natural tendency to really capitalize and understand the new contracts that were available to us and really focused on making those achievements and changes. There's also quite a bit of work here highlighted regarding pharmacy. Pharmacy continues to be an area of focus for us because costs go up so much, but we were relatively new into the 340B discount pricing world, so we're able to take full advantage of that, as well as some of the other ideas and options that are there too by moving from IVs into oral medications and really aggressively focusing on genetic substitutions through our pharmacy and therapeutics committee. Ultimately, the results here were in tens of millions of dollars, and this area continues to generate savings for us today. Next slide is an example of one of our functional transformation departments. We transformed our clinical engineering. Historically, biomedical services have been deployed at each of the individual facilities. And depending on the size of the facility, the level of service was either really, really good or not as good, just if they could not afford to have the level of services that were necessary. So through functional transformation, we brought forward all of the biomed folks and all the clinical engineers and really focused on standardizing and deploying services across all of our organization. And really looked at what can we do in-house versus what do we still need outside support to help work through that. So once we worked on in-house, there were significant savings there by bringing the work in-house and turning off external contracts. And secondarily, where we did need external contracts to help shore up our skill set, we were able to buy them on a ministry or organization-wide business to be able to negotiate a good contract with the vendors themselves. And as I noted here, we have savings of well over $1.5 million, and that continues to build for us too. Next slide, please. Then we got to a point after about 4 years where our original thousands of ideas, the list was getting exhausted. We were running out of opportunities from that idea list to be able to go forward. So we recognized the need to repopulate and reinvigorate the idea list to be able to continue our cost-saving, right-sizing journey. And again, we generated hundreds of ideas. We did all this internal without any use of consultants. And ultimately, we did use benchmarking, but as we sorted and sifted through the ideas, we have ultimately come down to about 23 ideas that we are actively now pursuing. And I would, in quotes, I would call these are the big areas. As we have moved through functional transformation and become more of an operating company rather than a holding company, the big ideas are really taking advantage of those organization-wide departments to be able to leverage and use the expertise and that nimbleness that's come with ministry-wide or organization-wide departments to really focus on the big pictures. When you're working across a $2.8 billion organization and we have a department that covers essentially the whole organization is responsible for that, small changes can result in really, really big dollars. So they're really focusing on all that. So we have about 18 ideas that are already underway. And again, we are actively measuring and tracking that progress. But we just added 5 more big ideas to that list. And those last five really big ideas came out. We still had several hundred ideas remaining. But again, we did a scoring process and aligning with our mission, our speed to value, the financial impact. And if it was we are now getting to the much more complex ideas to deal with because our low-hanging fruit is pretty much gone. And we've recently gone through a process where our executive leadership has ratified these new projects, and we are kicking those implementation teams off and getting them off and running. Next slide, please. So stepping back a little bit to kind of look at our process of our transformation is kind of wanted to progress through a timeline and how we work through that. Because as I mentioned, we really needed to change the culture initially to get us into a competency of managing our costs. So the initial couple of years, the burning platform was there, so we really needed to focus on the low-hanging fruit. But that also was how we were organized. We were organized to do things locally, so that's where we took advantage of that structure and tried to make things happen through that. And then we started to, and these aren't hard and fast because we still have a local emphasis on everything. It's just now self-governed as opposed to organization-wide governed. But years 2 and 3, that's when we started to really take our local talent and put it into an organization-wide mission and really leveraging those and taking advantage of all of that. And then taking, in years 4 and beyond, we'll continue to use our organization-wide teams and also really focusing on the big initiatives because the easy stuff has long since been handled. all the while and across all the years, we're really focused on clinical efficiency. How do we engage physicians and clinical leaders in really improving how we're delivering our care that's not only a good patient experience, but also it drives and achieves the clinical quality that we need by reducing errors and improving efficiency, length of stay, and all those kinds of things. And finally, all years, heavy focus on employee engagement. Our sisters have really driven us to be transparent, to communicate well with our employees, so that they understand what the ultimate bigger picture is, and that our sisters have a goal of being very, very respectful of our employees, and that the sisters are really asking us to manage in a way that eliminates the need for layoffs, but rather really focuses on utilizing attrition to be able to accomplish the things we need to do. Next slide, please. So moving away from kind of our annual or our timeline, this is a slide that I would say really sums up what the essentials are for our use of successful benchmarking. First of all, can't underestimate what the burning platform did for us. It really got everybody engaged because they understood what the ultimate goal was. We needed to change how we were not only financially performing, but also the cultural to come and change with that. We had access to accurate data. We really needed to take advantage of that and really work on things that have value. The beauty about benchmarking is you can kind of sort, using a farming term that we're used to here in Illinois, sort out the wheat from the chaff. Find the important stuff and really focus on that, and don't worry about things that either don't matter or have only a minimal impact to really worry about. Establish the right structure, and a key component of that is to have executive involvement and leadership to be able to drive the organization. The management team almost always will do what leadership thinks is important. So really working through that and doing that in an environment of data. Take advantage of the data that exists, apply it to the process, use it to help generate alternatives and make good decisions, but also it really instills the rigor to make sure that things happen. Finally, measure and communicate. The process throughout, we measured it significantly, not only compared to benchmarks, but also internally, so we could see the levels of improvements that we have. The beauty about measurement is not just to quantify the data, because me as a finance person, I really enjoy that, but it provides a tremendous opportunity to celebrate success, not just in financial terms, but in the clinical quality that's happened along the way. We can't objectively celebrate if we don't measure what we do. So that gets into whenever you celebrate, you get to communicate with people and really recognize the efforts of the hard work of the individual teams and individual members of those teams, and also in aggregate as we work forward with all of that. And it is, as we're comparing across benchmarks, there is an element of competition that gets in play when you're trying to improve your own benchmarks and your own performance. But at the same time, you see the rest of the benchmarks moving too. So it almost becomes an internal organizational competition as we try and move faster than the rest of the other organizations in our benchmarks. And finally, and most importantly too, is to, within that culture, really renew the ideas and the projects so that there's a continuous loop and feedback loop and project loop to make sure that we're always able to generate new ideas and seize any of those opportunities that exist. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Linda, and she can take us down the home stretch.
Thanks, Dave. Before I go into my last slide, I just want to mention that I Vantage has had just an incredibly positive and collaborative partnership with OSF over the past several years. And Dave, I want to thank you for that. I think our partnership has just been great, not only for everything that you've achieved, but your contribution to what I Vantage has as our knowledge web, where all of these different ideas that you have implemented have either come generically from OSF or have been the result of collaboration through some of our other clients as to best practices, leading practices, and strong practices. So we just really value you as a partner. When we began this discussion, we noted that CFOs reported that they lacked the tools and accurate data to support their cost reduction efforts. And now, based on this presentation, you can see that OSF's journey began with benchmarking, which delivered that trusted data and those insights so that they could size and prioritize their performance improvement agenda. You know, your benchmarking platform obviously is very important for that, but it's not a platform alone. You can see that OSF had a very well thought out approach. They had their broad leadership engagement. They used this platform to gain institutional trust and buy-in, as well as a focused understanding of the drivers of variance. And all that together enabled them to really engage their entire organization in their ACT journey. So although they started with a more traditional focus on labor and supplies at the facility level, you saw how they quickly began to look at integrated benchmarking data, looking at clinical length of stay, utilization, even physician variation. And because of that integrated benchmarking data, they were able to seek improvements beyond labor and supplies and inform their journey on an ongoing basis. So although there are many pathways to performance improvement, I think OSF's roadmap has created impressive results. They have truly created a cultural transformation. They're set up well for continued success. And again, big kudos to Dave, who was one of the key leaders of that entire process. So this concludes our presentation. We are very happy to answer questions from the participants. So Morgan, I'm going to send this back to you.
Thank you, Linda and Dave, for that fantastic presentation. We will now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled "Enter a question for staff" and clicking send. We will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. And we have a ton of questions coming in from the audience today. The first question is, did you have to look externally to help get the program off the ground, or were you able to get by just with internal resources?
As I quickly mentioned during the presentation, we did have an external consultant to help us kind of get jump started, but that was really only in the first just few months of the project to get us started. So we really focused internally, but the external resource that we also had was our benchmarking tool. And that tool comes to us, we populate that tool with our own information from our statistics and from our general ledger. That's all populated in there, and the benchmarking process really scrubs and tries to standardize the data so that everybody has the same information. So using that support to be able to provide us with the benchmarks, we are able to focus ourselves internally on those areas that fall up from the benchmark. We have confidence in our tool that it is providing us with the standardized data to be able to really focus on our internal activities with confidence, to know that if it shows up there, it's worth looking at. It doesn't mean there's always an opportunity, but it usually means that it is worth looking at to help us critique ourselves and understand if there's a better way to go.
Thanks for clarifying that, Dave. And another audience member is wondering, how did you overcome any engagement or communication gaps that you might have encountered between clinical and operational leadership?
That's a really good question, because communication ultimately does make for action. And the use of our collaborative teams within each of our own individual organizations, those teams were designed to be multidisciplinary, including clinical, physicians, financial guidance and counting to be able to make that happen. But we also, each of the organizations had an overarching steering team within itself to be able to make sure that those things were being done. So we had a organization-wide steering team that was looking at things, but also locally, at the individual facilities, they had their own teams to really drive performance and make sure that ultimately we were successful in achieving the overarching goals, which this isn't the only driver, but it was a piece, was to make sure that we met the incentive comp goals on behalf of all of our employees.
Great. Thanks for providing insight into that, Dave. And we have a ton of great questions coming in. And one audience member is wondering if you have to revisit and make any changes to your incentive structures to get folks on board.
As I said, we initially focused on purely cost savings. And there was a reason behind that. It's because we historically had relied on increasing our revenue. So we really focused on cost, and that's where the driver was, recognizing that there were still revenue opportunities out there. So now we have migrated in that process to look also at revenue. After practicing and becoming much more competent at managing our costs, we've now migrated into not only keeping the cost competency, but also now looking at revenue and looking for additional opportunities that exist there. And there certainly are some there, because that is an ever-changing and continuous environment too. So our efforts and where a lot of our new activity is going is in the revenue cycle area.
Excellent. Thank you for explaining that. And the next question is about burnout. Someone is wondering, the question is, my organization suffers from significant focus burnout after the initial development of a program because everybody is pulled in so many directions. How did you avoid the flavor of the month mentality and maintain long-term focus?
That's an interesting question, because that can be difficult with ever-changing priorities. But first and foremost, this is not an ever-changing priority. It's not a program of the month. It's become so much a part of our culture and how we do it that it becomes more of a frame of mind and a mindset to be able to really achieve and continue the objectives. We, as an organization, we also spend a lot of time prioritizing the hundreds and thousands of ideas that are out there, the vast majority of which are really, really good ideas, but they can also be incredible distractions. So really coming to grips with and becoming comfortable with, we're only going to focus on the important stuff. And if we miss a couple of little nooks and crannies here and there, that's okay, because we've gotten the really big projects along the way. And that's really helped kind of get out of the distractions that can come from the minutia of all the small, unnecessary and unimportant ideas.
Right, that's a great point, Dave. Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
And this is Linda. I just wanted to mention that as another evidence of the cultural shift that OSF has experienced is that their people can't wait to get their next updated data. Somehow they've tapped into this place in their leadership teams where they want to see the evidence of their improvement, and they want to see what's the next thing to work on. And again, just that evidence of a real cultural shift at OSF. Looking forward to getting their data.
Great, thanks for clarifying that, Linda. And we have an audience member who would like a little bit more insight into how you chose I Vantage, Dave. They ask, why did you pick I Vantage as your benchmarking provider versus another source like Truven Action OI?
Yeah, we've used I Vantage for many, many years, but we've also on occasion used Truven. They're both good organizations. They try and gather their data in a standardized, normalized fashion. What we found is the manner in which things are benchmarked. And this kind of drove us to go towards I Vantage. I Vantage, our benchmark, are similar hospitals for our organization or similar health systems of size and magnitude, and we compare to the individual 10 or 12 or 15 hospitals. Truven tends to be more of a, okay, I'm going to look at my lab across all of the labs within the database, and the lab may be at hospital X, but my radiology department may be at hospital B, and my surgery department may be at hospital J. And so you're kind of, it's the unproductive way to do that is to cherry pick that story, which makes your department look good. And by using I Vantage, and we're kind of we do get to understand our peer group a little bit, and we know where their strengths and weaknesses are too. But we also are able to identify if we do TAVRs, and there's some in the system that in the benchmarks that do TAVRs in the operating room, and some that do them in the cath lab. And then we can compare and contrast where is the best benchmark way to do that procedure. So we've looked at several benchmarking opportunities, including Premier is another one that's out there. And so they all have their good purpose. They're all credible, but we've chosen to stick with I Vantage, and we've been able to lever the tool well, and we really understand what its strengths and weaknesses are.
Thanks for explaining that distinction, Dave. And it looks like we have about time for one more question. One audience member is wondering if you could give an example of a problem that you faced. What benchmarking data was used, and how does I Vantage obtain the data?
The data comes primarily from our general ledger and all of the information, that financial and statistical information that comes with that. And then it gets applied against all of the different departments. It's also organized into kind of two areas. Functional data is those things at a departmental cost per unit of service. And then there's the clinical data, which is more across the organization, but may focus on a service line or a group of DRGs. So we use the variance from benchmarking to really inform where we need to look. And there's significant information within the benchmarking tool that helps us understand what the problem might be.
Great, thank you, Dave. And before we wrap up, Linda, was there anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think Dave covered it well. And again, I just want to mention that OSF has been not only a great partner, but they have, their success story is just one that I think really resonates in the industry for people who have had similar success stories or people who want to be like OSF. So thank you, Dave. And thanks, Beckers, for letting us have this opportunity to share the OSF story.
Excellent. Well, this concludes today's program. I want to thank Dave Steenerson and Linda Albury for their excellent presentation, and to our audience for participating. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.